livelihood should not depend on a legislative worker or a politician who has probably never worked a day in their life, who has probably led a privileged path along with their job that they finally end up with. So proud to propose. A few things in my speech today. I'll start with a few key points of setup, and then I'll be giving you two substantives. First, on meeting the workers' needs. Secondly, on creating tailored solutions. And thirdly, my second speaker will giving you a substantive on accountability. On to setup then. First of all, what does the status quo or the opposition stance actually look like, right? So this looks like some minimum wage protections. For example, you might have auditors coming every few years from the government to see whether or not these things are being upheld. There's also a lot of union busting that we see in the status quo. For example, in Starbucks, if you're suspected of even planning a protest, you're probably going to be fired, and you're probably going to be you're going to lose your job. So what this means then, a lot of people in the status quo then are afraid to lobby, and they're also out lobbied by big corporations who generally have a lot more money, who have a lot more power than these unions. Okay then, what is the problem that we're seeing? So workers are underpaid and overworked, and they're also generally unable to improve their current condition. That's as to why we're having this debate right now. Okay, the proposition stance then is to have stricter union protections and having a platform for discussion. So what this looks like is that no union busting is allowed by corporations, and striking is a protected right. That means you cannot fire people if you suspect them of planning on strikes. And we will also have regular meetings between union leaders and companies and company heads. So for example, a quarterly discussion on the state of affairs and whether they're seeing eye to eye. We also plan on having more national unions in general on our side of the house. For example, this looks more like the Canadian model or the Singaporean model, where workers from all over the country have an expansion in terms of the union, so everyone essentially joins the union and everyone is part of one. What we also have is weaker legislative protections. This looks like no minimum wage on our side of the house. Okay, I want to note quickly that this is not a this House win motion. That means we assume that we've achieved some form of union protection on our side of the house. They've achieved some form of legislative change as a baseline. And lastly, as a metric, we want to see who is actually better able to meet the needs of the workers and their changing and increasing demands. Okay, so on to my first substantive then on worker needs. So to frame, what does legislative change actually mean, and how does this happen, right? So first of all, this is quite a long and difficult process. So it looks like politicians having to talk amongst each other, getting the parliament behind you, getting a majority in order to pass this legislation. So this can take a long time because of bureaucracy, because of getting people on the same page, getting people to the exact number that you want it to be. Secondly then, a second layer here is that companies are actually able to influence these politicians, right? There's a lot of lobbying power with their money. They can fund politicians in terms of running their campaigns. So there's just a lot of say in terms of what companies are able to do within the government for these politicians. So what this means then is on opposition, maybe the change will happen much slower because the politicians can't get on the same page, and the change might not necessarily be good because these companies have so much lobbying power. And so another layer to this is that the government changes on their side of the house, right? There's different parties in power, there's different people in power. So changing governments means changing policies, and so some might campaign with the privatization on labor rights and labor protections, but some might not. But what is consistent is that inflation is happening and the living wages are getting higher, and so if change does not happen, these people are being left behind. Okay, let's look at the comparative on proposition then. What we propose is that we have regular meetings between these unions and companies leaders. What this means is that the unions are actually talking to the companies frequently through direct communication. Because you're not jumping through a middleman, it's so much faster to get change that you actually want because you're talking directly to the people who can make an impact on your lives, who can improve your wages. Okay. Secondly, why is it actually more likely for us to meet worker needs? Well, there's a humanization aspect to this as well, right? Because when you see and get to know the people who are working for you, who are asking for these changes, it's much easier and you're much more likely to connect on a human level and hear them out on their problems, right? So for example, let me look at myself. Like, I hear a lot about like poverty that happens in the world, but I've never, like, when I don't see it happening, or when I don't see it in person, it doesn't really feel like a real issue to me. But when I actually see it in person, I'm much more likely to feel sympathetic and empathetic to their issues. So this same logic applies here, where companies are much more likely to actually create change on a human level. On opposition, there's just some politician who's representing your cause who probably hasn't had to struggle the way you have in these working conditions or with the wages that you have, right? So they're not really fighting for the change with as much humanity as you would be. So the impact here is twofold. First, our change is much faster because these workers are actually in direct communication with the companies. But secondly, our change is much more likely as well because we have this humanization aspect, we have this aspect of personal connection where these companies are far more likely to listen to you. Okay, on to my second substantive, but before that, I'll take a PI if there's any on the floor.
How can you ensure that trade negotiations between these labor unions and these companies, despite the large power gap, will actually be maintained with some sort of equal right?
Okay, like this is the whole thing about strikes and like strikes, right? In terms of unions, because there's just so many people. Like for example, like we told you in our model, it's going to be happening on a national level, right? There's going to be unions on a national level, so every one of these workers are going to be part of this union. And so if all of them go on strike at once, obviously the company is largely unable to function, and so they need to listen to their workers in order to get back to earning a profit, which is what they want. Okay, secondly then, on my on tailored solutions, the premise of this is that solutions that we create are better suited to the workers and their specific needs. So on opposition then, they have sweeping legislative policies, right? These are national level dictations on minimum wage, and they're not very adaptive in terms of the different industries and in terms of what each worker actually needs, right? So this means then, there's a lot of gaps and loopholes where workers' needs are not actually met based on these very general legislations on minimum wage, when their case-by-case basis can be very, very different. So an additional layer here is that, again, these politicians may not understand the specific environment that these workers are working in, and doesn't know exactly what the lived experience of the people they're representing are. So on proposition then, you actually represent yourself, so you know your needs the best, you know what change needs to happen, you know what the living wage that's reasonable for you is. And so the impact here is that the change we get actually matters, and it actually has an impact and is the best suited for the workers themselves. So because we're actually able to prove to you that we get most effective, efficient, and best change, we're so proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Can I invite the Leader of Opposition? Here.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Picture a world where labor market regulations are suppressed and people are able to actually agree on their wages and working conditions. In government, they are able to actually decide their working conditions, eventually leading to a more fair world. So proud to oppose. So first, some rebuttals. We believe the problem with the government's case is the fact that their case rests on the assumption that these negotiations should actually be conducted on equal terms. Without minimum wage, we risk lowballing agreements that actually fail. And I'm going to explain why in my speech. Okay, so firstly, they talked about how it would be easier to connect on a human level, and that when people and workers actually talk about what they want, they would actually get it. But two folds to this rebuttal. Firstly, we believe that the company's main goal is actually money. So even if the humans actually get an aspect of deciding what's eventually gonna happen, these companies would still find a way to lowball and make sure that the company actually gets the benefit and the workers wouldn't actually get as much or like the same things as they have discussed. Secondly, we believe that these politicians actually do understand what these workers would need, as in their whole life they've actually been studying and actually understanding what these workers would need, and it's like their main job to discuss this, and we believe that the politicians would
Points of
actually.
information.
Yes.
Is it more effective to study about something we're actually experiencing?
We believe that these workers would still go through this like process of the company still, because these politicians studied about it and actually know how laws work. They would be able to more effectively make these laws to benefit the workers as it's their job. And we never know what these workers might eventually get if the law doesn't go through. Okay, now on to my before I actually begin my argument, I would like to show what we as opposition stand for and believe. A stronger push in collective bargaining rights would look like two things. First, a messy and unorganized compilation of rights and negotiations due to the fact that only a select few workers are actually chosen to represent the majority, meaning voices and goals would actually ultimately be lost. And second, a rise in worker strikes that not only disrupt the industry but stability of the government. On the other hand, legislated regulations are set by the government in law and enforced in the betterment of average civilization. This includes minimum wage, overtime working hours, etc. So today, our readiness actually proved to you why legislative labor regulations are actually better than collective bargaining rights. Now let me move on to my first substantive argument about how collective bargaining actually loses the voices of many more employees. Legislative labor regulations are clear, concise, and well thought out in terms of benefits to both civilians, employees, and society. They think of like the long term and like benefits and like take years to actually consider and to pass. Collective bargaining rights are much less organized in comparison, and they actually lack the vast insight into like other issues, and they're actually representing the labor union. Oh, and this usually like is built upon the limited like employees representing like the labor union. This causes two things. First, voices and wants of some employees actually getting misrepresented or lost, and second, they're actually short-sighted in the effect that it might bring to society. Okay, my second argument. Okay, second on the effectiveness of bargaining and actual legislative labor market regulations. If regulations or rules are actually under the law, written and valid, it's going to be really hard for people to actually disregard or go against it. So why would this actually happen? Because
information.
Yes.
If you have a contract agreeing to certain situations based on each individual company, is not violating that contract not equally illegal as violating the minimum wage?
But we believe that if the contract is under the company, there's going to be far easier ways for them to find loopholes through this and not with the law, because the law is under the government. Okay. So why would this actually happen? We believe that in our status quo, the company's main priority is to actually have power and make money, and this is obviously the truth because, yeah. Okay, so they would obviously find loopholes to minimize money that they want to spend and maximize like workers' working time, because this is how they ultimately make money. Furthermore, if something is actually not in the law or written properly with everyone following it, like the same right, it's going to be really hard for it to actually be effective. So government organizations are actually more well versed in like what citizen needs, rather than a company. So we believe that with these politicians actually fighting for what the workers need, or if they like maybe ask like some workers what they actually want, and like we believe that they still have common sense. So they would ultimately fight for a more stable and like beneficial law for these workers. And companies know that they have like something to lose if they like disobey the law. So we believe that the company contract is actually easier to disobey. So the impact of this, the companies would actually get a much easier way to actually disobey the original contract, and workers would actually not get all their regulations met, leading to a larger pay gap where the richer would get richer and the poorer would get poorer. Okay, this leads to my second point about how this might happen. As I've explained before, companies will find it easier to disobey these rules that they've set themselves because workers don't really have much experience in law, and the companies would obviously want to maximize their profits. So the profit, who does this go to? It obviously goes to the CEO. And where does this profit actually get taken away from? The workers. So what would happen is these CEOs would actually keep finding ways to actually get this money from the workers. And if this keeps happening, this would give the upper class a upper hand and make the pay gap become bigger. And the impact of this would be that the world would become overall less stable and the pay gap would increase. For all these reasons above, so incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank you, leader opposition, for the speech. Can I invite the Deputy Prime Minister here?
Enacting legislation is one thing, but ensuring accountability while maintaining worker rights is another. We are the only side of the House that can ensure accountability is consistent and equitable, which is why I'm so proud to propose 3 things in my speech today. First on a bit of reconstruction, second on rebuttals, and third on our sub on accountability. Before I move on, 2 clarifications. Number 1, our negotiations conducted on equal terms, we see this as a big push from opposition side of the House. We tell you the entire logic of unions is that there's power in numbers. Essentially, if you have an entire worker base and they all believe one thing and they decide to go on strike, companies are in a very tough situation where they don't have anybody to do the rough work, dirty work for them, and because they're incentivized by profit, they're incentivized to avoid the situation where all the workers go on strike, where all the workers are working against them. Therefore, by leveraging power in numbers, these negotiations are actually made to be more equal, despite the fact that employers naturally have more power than their employees. Second of all, who will actually be involved in these negotiations, and are there any voices lost? We tell you that a union representative is elected through democratic process, as in the union members will elect this person that they feel will best represent their needs and best fight for their rights, right? We tell you this is so much better than what they have on their side of the House, where the person these union workers or the person these workers are being represented by is a politician who is elected by the entire county or the entire region, also through democratic process, but it's far more detached and less direct, and they're not a worker themselves, so they won't understand as much what these workers need and what their rights are, whereas a union worker is more directly elected and representative of what they want. Okay, we gave you 2 points in the short speech. Number 1 on meeting worker needs, and number 2 on tailored solutions. For meeting worker needs, we told you 2 things. Number 1, that legislative change on their side of the House is based on the administration that's in power, and it has to happen every few years, which means there's a long, arduous process that can be influenced by money and the power of corporations. And second of all, we told you that we get direct and efficient change because we have mechanisms of direct conversation and humanization. They said basically that companies want profit, so they're incentivized to lowball these workers and not give them what they deserve. A few things here. We agree on the incentive of these companies to want to make a profit, but they completely miss the entire human mechanism that we have on our side of the House, which is that when you're engaged in conversations with these workers, when you understand their needs, like, oh, I have a kid, I have this family, you're more likely to actually empathize with them and see that the reason why they want to, increase working conditions or increase wages is because they genuinely want a better life. You're much more likely to empathize on our side of the House when there's more contact, whereas on their side of the House, they don't have these conversations and they don't get this human mechanism. Okay, second on tailored solutions, we tell you that when workers are representing themselves, we get changes that are more tailored to the needs of the workers in each industry. They said 2 things. Number 1, that politicians inherently understand what workers need because they have studied it for so long. But we tell you that even if you studied it, because you have a completely different background, you will never know what it means to be a worker in that situation. You will never understand their needs as well as they do themselves, and they simply cannot combat this, because obviously I understand myself better than some politician does in government, even if they've studied like students in international schools, right? Second of all, this completely ignores our case-by-case argument, which is basically saying that workers in different industries have different needs, so you can't have sweeping legislature that basically works to cater and respect the needs of everyone in different industries when these needs are inherently different. Before I move on to rebuttals, I'll take a quick while.
As our first argument is stated that company that work only a select few workers would actually get their voices heard.
And I told you that the mechanism by which this happens is there's a union rep, and the union rep is elected through democratic process, just as a politician is elected through democratic process, but our democracy is a lot more direct because your union worker is one of you, and they're more likely to understand your needs as opposed to a politician that's never been in that position. Okay, they have 2 points. Number one, on the quality of legislator, they said that legislation is good because smart people take years to make it. And in doing so, they inherently concede that this takes years and years, and it's also subject to administration change, so it's extremely arduous, and they have to keep fighting for change every few years, which is extremely inefficient. And second of all, we tell you that yes, politicians are educated, but again, even if they have positive incentives, they do not understand what it means to be a worker, they do not understand their specific rights for each industry. Second of all, they talk about people basically sticking to legislature and which one is more likely to incentivize employers to actually stick with the conditions and the standards that are set. They say that people will find loopholes. Okay, we tell you again, based on our POI that we've already asked, that going against a contract that was signed between worker and employer is just as illegal as going against a legislation that was set by the government. No, thank you. So on either side of the house, they will face legal backlash, and we don't see how they're more likely to be illegal on our side of the house, but not illegal on your side of the house. Second of all, we don't think that workers need experience in law to be able to fight for their rights. They know what their rights are, they know what they want, and they're able to organize themselves into unions in order to fight for these rights as well. They don't need to be lawyers to do so. And finally, on the sub on accountability, the premise of the substantive is that on prop, we have a better mechanism for accountability, ensuring sufficient wages and working conditions. 2 points of framing here. Number one, let's characterize government power. It's not a limitless entity. They have human and financial capital limitations. And they govern a large region with hundreds of thousands of people and many, many businesses and corporations that they oversee. Second of all, what is ops model for accountability? So the Gov creates legislation which sets a standard for wage and working conditions, and employers are then responsible for ensuring that their business meets these standards, and the only mechanism they have for accountability are government audits every few years, ensuring that this wage and working standards are actually being met in these corporations. So what is the problem that we see on op then? There's twofold. Number one, we tell you there's a lack of consistently sufficient audits, because this branch of government that is in charge of audits is often severely understaffed. We see this in the US, for example, where we have regions where there are like 12 dams and only 2 auditors that are in charge of auditing said dams. So this not only causes a lack of auditors, but the audits themselves are extremely infrequent, maybe once in 5 years or once in 3 years. And this leads to a lack of consistent checking mechanism, and it's easy for conditions to slip and fall into bad working situations. Because this is likely to happen because, again, keeping everything working well and having good conditions requires a lot of effort on the employer's part. Therefore, it's easy to slip without someone looking over your shoulder constantly and making sure that you're actually keeping these conditions fair. And second of all, when this slip happens, on their side of the house, workers have far less power to actually hold these employers accountable and have conversations with them saying that, hey, we argued for this, but you're not doing this, therefore we need to hold you accountable. But on their side of the house, we don't have workers doing this, we have these auditors doing this, when they have limited capability, so they can't ensure that they're consistently held accountable. On our side of the house, the workers themselves act as a checking mechanism for these employers. They have union meetings, they discuss the problems, they work with employers to improve these situations, and they basically provide a form of consistent accountability that is completely non-existent on their side of the house because we have accountability, because we better protect worker rights. I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech. Now invite the Deputy from the Opposition to hear.
legislative panel, proposition sees the entire world through rose-tinted spectacles. When you get rid of crucial types of regulations such as minimum wage and actually reinforce the narrative that collective bargaining rights and protection is correct, we think ultimately this actually decreases the entire productivity of the workforce and ultimately leads to lower worker rights on their side of the house. So I'm incredibly proud to oppose today. 3 things in my speech. First, 3 clarifications, then rebuttals, before moving on to my extension on how the productivity of the workforce will actually be lowered. Given that, let's look at a few reclarifications, as the first few exchanges have been quite messy. First of all, I want to clarify what exactly is the difference between the collective bargaining system and the law system that we are so proudly proposing. Essentially, we think on their side of the house, the collective bargaining system looks like when workers go on strike and try to change their working conditions in the status quo. We think inherently going on strike and stopping their work is the only way for them to get their voices heard, because employees and employers have different incentives. I think that's the only way that employees are ever able to get their voices heard. We think ultimately the negotiations that come out from their side of the house are never as good as legislative laws for a few reasons. Firstly, we think labor unions are most likely short-sighted. They only see what's in front of them, how they want to gain higher wages at that instant without considering other types of other types of consequences that governments actually take into account when they determine minimum wages or other types of regulations. But we think secondly, simply because this is a negotiation between employees and employers, it is not considered as official as these types of government's regulations. And we think that means thirdly, that these companies have less to lose once they infringe on these types of collective bargaining negotiations compared to when they infringe legislative labor market regulations. Next then, I want to characterize what exactly our legislative system actually looks like. We think this looks like when politicians actually decide what these types of labor market regulations looks like. But we think the main push we hear from proposition side of the house is that, oh, these politicians don't really understand what's going on in these types of working conditions. We argue that politicians can still get this type of understanding through a few ways. We think firstly, we already tell you that they study a lot about these conditions and these types of working conditions and how exactly to ameliorate them in a correct method. But we think secondly that there's still ways for politicians to get into contact with people who don't have such good working conditions. They can go visit these types of companies and actually listen to what these workers have to say. We think ultimately that works on both sides of the house, and we think actually politicians are able to do this much better because they take into account what exactly is going on in our legislative system right now and the future consequences that these may entail. Given that, I want to move on to rebuttals. What we hear from proposition side of the house is that they come up here and say that, oh, these types of legislative laws are not tailored to all workforce. A few pieces of rebuttal to this. Firstly, we think the government is actually incentivized to tailor these types of legislative laws towards the current workforce and the workforce in the status quo. Why is this the case? I think this is the case for 3 reasons. Firstly, they probably want to cater to their voter base, which is most likely probably going to be workers. I think ultimately they must win the favorability of these workers in order to be elected into the government parliament, right? So I think ultimately this gives them the incentive to create labor market regulations that actually correspond and cater to these types of people. Before I continue.
Do you believe workers working in construction and workers working at Subway have the same grievances and needs?
We think ultimately these legislations ensure that at least there's a baseline in order to ensure that these minimum wages are respected and you can't completely exploit these workers working in construction places, right? But we think secondly then, they literally just want to improve the conditions of their workers in order to improve the productivity and the GDP of their entire country. We think that is very intuitive and straightforward. But we think thirdly, they probably want to increase or implement better minimum wages because they want to rivalize with the previous party in order to ensure that they can cater to their voter base. But we think next then, they never give any incentive why these types of bargaining powers will actually work. We think they give this flimsy empathy mechanism, but we think ultimately we already tell you why we still get that on our side of the house. And we think ultimately when a company is most likely more profit incentivized than empathy incentivized, so when when they see that they can earn more money while ignoring the empathy aspect and the humanized aspect that they so proudly claim for, we think ultimately they're probably not going to listen to these types of workers and instead just continue trying to exploit these workers. And since there's no minimum wage on their side of the house, this phenomenon is going to be way worse. But we think lastly then, they never prove why they get equal representation on their side of the house. Sure, if in a democratic way they elect some kind of representative for the labor union, we think ultimately they never really mechanize for us why this person will most likely be the correct representation of what all of these workers want, considering the fact that there are so many different types of workers in the status quo. Given that, I want to move on to my extension on how the productivity of the workforce will actually decrease on their side of the house. Why is this the case? We think this is the case for 3 reasons. Firstly, individuals probably go on strike and stop working. We've already mechanized to you why this is the only way for employees to get their voices heard. But secondly, then, we think these individuals probably demand for more because now they're eradicating the baseline for how much wage these types of workers actually have. But we think thirdly, then, it also sets a precedent that you can only get your rights through fighting, through bargaining, and we think ultimately this means more uprisings from the labor force in general. What exactly does this look like? We think this looks like 2 different things in LEDCs and METCs. Firstly, in less economically developed countries, this looks like Bangladesh sweatshops. We think on their side of the house, even when these people go on strikes and protests, their voices are most likely not heard and are oppressed again because firstly their employers just have so much more power over them and so much more leverage. And I think secondly, these people probably don't want to risk the ability to feed their family and to keep their family alive in order to protest. I think ultimately on their side of the house this is so much worse because you don't have minimum wage to protect these people anymore. But we think on our side, at least we have laws to stop these atrocities, and it's much easier to call these employers out, especially on our side of the house, because the government knows what these people need. But we think in MEDCs, even in their side, their best case, when you try to get higher pay, it's still very ineffective due to the unorganized, intrinsic nature of these types of organizations. Because we are the only ones who stand for the working rights of all people, we're so incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech. Can I invite the government whip here.
From each what they can provide to each what they need. The moment that opposition comes up here and tells us that politicians are better at understanding workers' needs than people who work in these companies, the people who represent the very workers that they themselves are, they lose this case. A few things in this speech then. A few clarifications, and then secondly, I'll use three main questions to help me understand why we take the cake for proposition. Firstly, on who gets more effective change, secondly, who gets faster change, and third, who can maintain it for the longest point in time. And then last, I'll contend on their last substantive, which seems like it was just kind of thrown in there for no reason. Okay, a few notes then. Firstly, this is not a this house was. We brought this up in first, reinforced it in second. But what this is actually mean is that we assume that the first time is successful. So if we're going to be charitable and assume that there already is an existing minimum wage on their side of the house, then we can also assume that there is a bargaining rights and protections that have been established on our side of the house. What the crux of this what the metric of this debate then is about who can keep meeting these workers' needs moving forward in the future. It is a chicken and the egg scenario where in the status quo there's a negative feedback cycle where workers are pushing for more wages and more rights while companies are pushing back. On opposition, they have no solution to fix this and assume that their solution is this kind of negative feedback cycle benefits workers more. On proposition, we are arguing to break the cycle. So what does this actually mean? It means that we're essentially debating the prospect of strong unions versus the reliance on the minimum wage and different regulations on their side of the house. Okay then, firstly on who gets the most effective change. Number one, on power dynamics. Opposition wants to talk about how there's going to be massive power dynamics between the employers and they're going to end up lowballing. This is kind of something that's been throughout their entire case. We don't think, obviously this is true. We're not going to deny that. But they completely ignore, or not ignore, they do not fully take down argument on how humanistic negotiations are incredibly important. So yes, they do have an incentive to profit, but I think we cannot underestimate how difficult it is to look someone in the eye, understand that you both have children that you care about, and then tell them, no, we're actually not going to help you pay for the medical bills, etc. On opposition, they assume that they have successful negotiations from the politicians, but the metric, but then in cases of legislation, the metric becomes money and lobbying. The humanism is completely destroyed when you're acting from a transactional basis. It's more likely to be measured by the amount of money that you can put into the lobbying and legislative system, as opposed to the amount of emotional depth. And as humans, emotional creatures, the studies have proven that being able to negotiate face-to-face is far more effective than through, say, for example, text or any kind of digital non-facial interactions. Okay then, even if they want to argue that the lowball, we argue that any kind of lowball is far better than no change at all. Because what we can tell you is we have, yes, plenty of history of unions in America getting lowballed, but we also have a situation of complete stagnation in the federal minimum wage at $7.25. Many studies have shown that for the minimum wage to have kept up with the different living costs for the last 60 years, it would have to be at about $40 to $60 depending on the state. So yeah, we have examples of lowballing, but they have also examples of completely no change. So we would still take the lowballing at our worst case scenario, but we told you that this is not a problem. Secondly, on incentive analysis, right? Opposition tells us that politicians are better than companies because they study these policies, they study poverty, and they're more able to understand and create the kind of change that the workers want to see. All right, few responses to this. Again, we talked about how experience is far more important than having this kind of secondary education where you're learning about poverty through textbook photos. And they don't give us a proper response as to why actually their textbook photos are able to help them have more empathy and push for more change. Because again, it's not about how qualified their writing of the legislation is. It's more so about how much effort they're willing to put into that legislation and back it up even when big companies are paying them a lot of money to not do so. Secondly, we argue that actually the education that they receive is not very conducive to benefiting the poor, because a lot of the literature in economics will not teach you the benefits of unions, and rather emphasizes deregulation, especially in places like more economically developed countries like America and parts in Europe, where they emphasize this neoliberal rhetoric of less regulation equals more growth. But the most intuitive response that we can come up here and tell you is that if these politicians are so competent, then why are we debating this motion? So clearly right now, there's a lot of these unions are pushing for legislation, but it's not actually having an effect. What on proposition we're arguing for is a mindset change, because a mindset change for these unions to start focusing on increased protection and collection of bargaining rights, as opposed to keep pushing lobbying where their money can never win out over big companies' money. Yes, I'll take the PLY.
How can you ensure workers' rights are actually being met when these companies are greedy and want money?
Okay, I'm actually going to talk about this right now. So why are companies more incentivized to actually invest in these workers? So the reason why we think companies won't actually lowball and abuse workers is because they have an incentive to maintain a good relationship. It is a positive feedback cycle for them to invest in well-trained, most skilled employees who can then bring them the most profit. So because this is not at this House Woods, and because we assume that there's some fundamental level of protection, on proposition we turn this negative feedback cycle into a positive feedback cycle, where happier workers are more productive and then get more rights that then become happier. Politicians, however, are fueled by the optics of progress, as opposed to companies which are then actually held to the standard of actual progress, because workers can feel what companies regulate on them, but they can't necessarily feel what politicians promise. Okay then, why do we get the most nuanced change? So they talk about representation and why we don't have any mixed or why these democratically elected representatives are helpful. Firstly, they're democratically elected, so are politicians. So if by that metric, then why are politicians helpful? But secondly, why are we actually more representative? Because the workers who are elected are meritocratically chosen based on being a worker in that situation. So as opposed to politicians who are chosen perhaps based on charisma, etc., they understand the system through and throughout. Okay, secondly, on speed and long-term change. why do we actually get faster change? They acknowledge on their side of the house that legislation takes a very long time. So why do we, they argue that we also have very short-term unions, but we argue that this is not true because politicians also have short-term means with 4-year terms served in the Senate, etc., versus workers where they have 40-year tenure and an incentive to maintain good relationships with their companies are far more likely to prioritize this long-term thinking. Additionally, we have far better corrections for the system because on their side of the house, enforcement and correction are both by legislations, which they admit to themselves is long-term. As opposed to us, it's a consistently flexible set of rights and contracts that are revised every financial quarter or financial year, and it's far more adapted to each specific situation. Okay, this also then allows for a lot more accountability. Lastly, very quickly on the more economically developed countries, in many of these less economically developed countries, politicians are the corrupt ones. In this case, workers can only use what they have to themselves, which is their ability to protest and to strike. For those reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank the government for the speech and I invite the opposition minister here for a relationship with the company.
My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. The fact that Proposition Bench has no minimum wage, no legislative authority, and no standard to follow in the case of what exactly a good negotiative power or a good agreement between these workers' rights is exactly why they lose this debate today. Very proud to oppose. Now, before I go on to clashes, some world building, as well as some brief rebuttals, I would like to first case out what exactly opposition is winning this debate right now. We believe that opposition is winning on 2 cases. Number 1, negotiative power, and number 2, how we also have to account for other things than workers' rights, such as societal impact when it comes to changing these legislative issues. Now, number 1, on why exactly productivity is equally as important as the rights these workers get. Now, Proposition Bench keeps pushing forward this notion that these workers are oppressed. They don't have enough workers' rights, or they're not able to sufficiently provide for themselves. We rebut to you in both our first and second speech with 2 mechanisms. Number 1, the fact that these legislative rights are a bigger picture of the government. The fact that they take so long to deliberate on, so long to pass, is precisely why we need to make sure they're more emphasized on and they're more kept. It is because that these politicians actually take the state of the mind of both the country and both the civilians that these legislative rights prove more beneficial to the workers. And why exactly is this? Now, under the case of proposition, even if we do buy the argument that yes, some companies might be willing to give these workers higher pay, what we don't account for is the fact that if these strikes continue on giving and more companies keep campaigning for higher and higher pay, what we risk is 2 things. Number 1, inflation of average goods, as my second speaker has stated, due to the fact that these productivity as well as these high pages also directly interfere into the economic status of our world. And number 2, how it lead to less productivity in MEDC countries where these workers will gain the notion that as long as they keep fighting and keep getting strikes later, they'll eventually be able to gain all they need. Now, second rebuttal to why it is so important that workers represent themselves based on the industry. Now, we as the opposition bench push forward this notion that actually these workers' unions and these stronger collective bargaining rights don't actually showcase what exactly these workers' needs. And why exactly is this? The only rebuttal we hear on this from proposition side is that there is a democratically elected union rep. However, why do we tell you that this democratically elected union rep obviously falls short between the governmental officials? Well, first case of rebuttal towards this union rep is most likely also an employee, meaning that they prioritize their own needs rather than the needs of all the other workers themselves. Now, what does this look like? The worker right, because they're an employee, they're going to assume that every other employee in the company, all their other colleagues, will face similar needs to them. So they might propose individual high pay without actually considering what the consequences of this may prove onto other people. Now, second of all, we tell you that we actually do need a middleman to inform these companies and to inform these trade negotiations what exactly the status of our society is. We believe that just by providing higher pay isn't enough incentive or isn't enough mechanism on why this trade union actually protects or increases our society's power in the first place. Now, moving on to argumenting on clashes. I will take your POI now.
Are you arguing against increased wages so the parents can send their children to school because it will make average goods more expensive?
Now, why exactly is this case of some people gaining higher wage on proposition still falling short between opposition side? Well, this is because of two cases. Number one, the fact that government side has still yet to fail to give us an example of why these trades and why these negotiations will actually bring forth beneficial agreements between both the workers and the companies. They also fail to mechanize why exactly, just because we might buy the fact that some people do gain higher wages, why the other people who are suffering without the implementation of minimum wage will actually be enough to justify the fact of getting rid of this legislative standard. Now, why exactly is minimum wage so important, even if the fact it doesn't actually support a higher cost of living for the majority? Well, we tell you two things. Number one, the fact that in the best case scenario on proposition side, the only thing they gain is that some companies, yes, we may buy into the fact that they feel more empathy and they actually do give some workers higher pay, but ultimately, in the vast majority where these companies will be able to find legal loopholes, will be able to negotiate these trades as beneficial to provide a sense of false solvency. Ultimately, these workers, without having the correct standard to face, without having an official regulation such as the minimum wage, these workers will not know they are being lowballed, as my second and first speaker had overly greatly emphasized. And why is this negative? Because although in some cases where people might succeed, they're not accounting for the vast majority where these workers are just trying to live by, just trying to make enough money to get by without being actively exploited by these companies. And we already tell you that both sides have conceded these companies have greedy incentives. They want to maximize profit, meaning they're very likely to find legal loopholes when not faced with the explanation of legislative rules such as minimum wage, meaning they're far more likely to exploit the workers on proposition bench. Now, moving on to equal representation, and before I move on, I will take your plea on.
What do you think is more likely to empathize? Someone who's worked as your manager for 20 years or a politician that sees you once every election cycle for a meet and greet?
Now we tell you we actually don't need empathy. Do you know why? We need understanding on the current status of our society. Although these legislative workers or these workers who are in these companies might be like, oh, I feel so bad for you. I need you. I know you need money for the pay. They don't actually think of the bigger picture, as we keep emphasizing. In order for proposition bench to win, they need to explain why not only these workers are being benefited, but why the vast society also, in regards to our point on productivity, as well as the lack of minimum wage reinforcement. So moving on to equal representation, which side actually benefits workers in the long-term scenario? Well, we tell you it is opposition bench. Now, why exactly is this? Even if we do concede to the fact that we have a less empathy or less difference in all industries, we believe that as long as the fact that we maintain a sense of equality and a sense of standardized legislative minimum wage or worker rights that is agreed by all factions, we actually still win this debate due to the fact that we at least offer, in our worst case scenario, a society where workers, although they're not getting paid high salaries, they're still able to relatively make their way in life. While in proposition bench, while their best case scenario is yes, we can concede that there might be more empathy. There might be some people that manage to get these high wages. Ultimately, there are going to be a vast majority of companies where these negotiations will be infringed upon. Well, they're going to lowball these workers, where they're going to try to portray it as a fake solvency and take advantage of these workers even more. Now, what is the worst case scenario on both sides of the house? Well, we believe on opposition bench, yes, we have minimum wage, and these might not necessarily be the highest possible wage you can think of, but at least we have stability. At least we have productivity, where workers are still incentivized to continue on without going on strikes every other afternoon. While on proposition bench, their worst case is inflation, as well as society where productivity stunts, where workers are not actually able to agree on what factions, on what rights they want to agree on, and they have no actual standard to follow. For all these reasons above, I am very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition for their speech. Can I invite the opposition to reply? Thank you.
My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think at the end of the debate, it's very, very obvious that opposition wins this debate and takes it down by miles. Why exactly is this the case? We think proposition never does three things. Firstly, they don't explain the mechanisms behind why exactly collective bargaining power will be so effective and why exactly these companies will be so incentivized to follow this, except for their very flimsy humanity type of mechanism, which we think we've already repeatedly targeted and rebutted with several times. Secondly, then, they rebut and drop most of our arguments about like productivity, about how the entire workforce and how the entire like productivity of our workforce is actually going to go down. They never really rebut against this and only play on this like really humanitarian aspect without really directly tackling the root problem of our current status quo. But I think thirdly, then, they never really fulfill the burden about why exactly minimum wage is so much worse than having these people argue for their kind of collective bargaining power without really like understanding what's going on with the status quo and understanding what's going on with the workforce. We think we sufficiently proved to you why politicians are more qualified for this job and how they're more long-sighted and how they're able to understand all the consequences that this entails. Given that, I want to move on to clashes. We've seen two clashes in this debate. Firstly, which side actually creates more equal representation and how whether humanization is more effective than like labor market regulations. But I think secondly then also is on who produces better change. Why do we win the first clash then? We think what we hear from propositions out of the House is that, oh, they're gonna get equal representation because they're gonna have a democratic like employee election. We think ultimately this still doesn't really work because this type of employee election probably only prioritizes these employees who have a certain type of skill set, who are just the same as politicians, except they're in the workforce. We argue that this probably isn't going to be much better because these companies are most likely profit incentivized. Therefore, they're not going to just look at this type of humanized scenario and then suddenly become so lenient and charitable to a point where they're going to decrease their net revenue in order to become more charitable and become more of a human. We think ultimately the probability that this happens is very low on their side of the House, and they never sufficiently mechanize why exactly this will happen. While on our side of the House, we tell you why politicians are the best suited people for this type of scenario. We tell you they're qualified, they see in the long run what is going to happen to the entire society, both on a societal level and both on an individual level. We argue that on both sides of the House, there's still this element of empathy that happens either ways, and we think that our side of the House is more productive in creating change, which leads me very nicely to my next clash on why we win on change. We think ultimately change is not bad even if it happens in the long term, as we've already stated to you in our third speaker. We think instead in the long term this actually creates more type of reflection and more type of ability to judge what the status quo looks like right now, which inherently is much better on our side of the House. On their side of the House, they have very heated types of discussions, heated type of change. They have strikes every other afternoon. We think ultimately that's not very good for the society. It's not very good for these types of individuals either. Given that, let's move on to some world building. We think on opposition's worst case scenario, at least we have a baseline, at least we have a minimum wage that still stabilizes the economy, allows the economy to flourish and grow, and actually to become more productive over the long term. We think in proposition's worst case then, we think that companies are most likely not going to listen. They're not going to care about this person who says, oh, I can't feed my children, simply because they're these power-hungry and greedy type of organizations who are most likely going to lowball these individuals. But instead of like giving up these individuals, just raise strikes and creates more inflation and less productivity in the long term. When we take opposition at our best, we think at least we have this sense of standard and allow all of these individuals to be equal in the long term. For these reasons, so proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition reply for the speech, and I invite the government reply and the please.
A politician may know a lot about education. They may have studied it their entire life, but with regards to my rights and needs as a Singaporean international student, I understand it far better, and my peers and Deshaun and Sabrina understand it far better than any politician ever will, regardless of how many interviews they conduct. Okay, first, quick rebuttals on the productivity of workforce, which is basically that the only way we get rise on our side of the House apparently are through strikes, and this is going to be inefficient for the economy. Two responses here. Number one, we tell you that a strike is a last resort situation. If so, what happens when no one is listening to unions in situations where the conditions are so bad that everyone is willing to actually like go against their employer, go against the company, and agree to go on a strike? This is not the only mechanism for change, and it's definitely not the most common mechanism for change. So please don't let them misconstrue this on their side of the House. Okay, second of all, we tell you that even if there is some economic short-term downfall for having like a lack of productivity due to occasional strikes, we are willing to sacrifice this short-term impact to create a culture where employers listen to employees and actually respect their worker needs. And we tell you that we would rather fight for higher wage regardless of whatever economic impact it has, because when workers can't afford basic health care, when they can't put food on their table or shelter over their head, they cannot work and the economy will automatically collapse. So ensuring worker needs and worker rights is the most important thing, first of all. Okay, now on to clashes. Number one, who gets better representation for workers? So off they say like we have a government politician who has spent many years reading textbooks on labor and poverty and super knowledgeable about this. Okay. Main thing is they don't prove why a politician is the best person to represent workers. They say that yes, they're better because they know more about the country, they know more about long term, they know more about society as a whole. But why do we need this person with this specific knowledge to be able to advocate for workers' rights? Why don't we need someone who is best knowledgeable about workers' rights and best informed about workers' rights to advocate for workers' rights? Why do they need to have all this additional information about the country as well? They never prove why that is important and give us any concrete examples. Second of all, we tell you that their whole meet and greet, like interacting with workers, is not at all comparable to actually being a worker itself and like having this community of workers and knowing what workers' needs and like what their rights are and what's the current problem. So they cannot use that to like somehow get our benefits on their side of the house as well. And third of all, we tell you that a worker representative is not just acting in their own interest. They know what the community needs. They share many of the community's needs, and they've talked and negotiated and selected to be a representative. So we tell you that they are in the best position to actually advocate for the general needs of the workers' community and for the general rights of the community as well. Okay. And we also tell you the two mechanisms by which we get change, which are completely ignored in theirs of the House. The first is through powers in numbers, which is how unions have been functioning for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is that 1,000 people versus one person is equally balanced insofar as that one person is the employer. Even if they have more power, there's still power in numbers with the unions as well. Okay, second on who gets better laws and who is more suited to the needs, who gets laws more suited to the needs of the workers. On opposition, number one, it takes way too long because there are changes in every administration and there's also long deliberation over the legislative process. And second of all, even if politicians, we assume that they're completely positively incentivized, that they're not corrupt, in their best case, policies are still generalized and sweeping and cannot cater to every individual industry and their different needs. They cater to the general community of workers, which cannot be specific and cannot be exactly what the workers in every industry need. Okay, third on minimum wage. We tell you that minimum wage and working conditions are stagnant and inflexible on their side of the house, as the people who actually are getting impacted are not the ones with control over this minimum wage. On our side of the house, we're so much better exactly for this reason, because the people impacted are those with the ones that have control and agency to enact change. And finally, on the third clash on accountability, I just want to stress how important this clash is, because you can make as many legislations as you want, you can have as many rules as you want, but unless you can ensure consistent accountability, no change will actually happen, because the change is not being enacted on a day-to-day basis. They completely drop my entire sub on who gets better accountability by basically saying that, okay, like somehow these legislators are gonna like create these laws and then everybody's just gonna magically follow it. On their side of the house, we tell you that they have audits every few years. There's no one looking over their shoulders of the companies, and they're able to have these conditions slowly slipping away. Whereas on our side of the house, we have workers who on a day-to-day basis are able to see what's happening to them and hold these employers accountable. Therefore, we actually get real change on our side of the house. I'm so proud to propose.